and welcome to Viewpoint. I'm Volodymyr Solokhub. Join me now to discuss the IMF Bailout Program for Ukraine is the team leader for Ukraine Reforms Communications Taskforce, Mr. Taras Kachka. Mr. Kachka, welcome back to Viewpoint.
Thanks, welcome.
Mr. Kachka, just last year, Ukraine missed the third tranche of the IMF $35 billion bailout for Ukraine. And just several weeks ago, the IMF President Christine Lagarde voiced her concerns about the slow pace of reforms which are happening in Ukraine. Do you think there is a chance that IMF will withdraw its support to Ukraine completely?
Of course, this is an absolutely negative scenario, and nobody actually believes that this scenario is key scenario for the moment. I believe that Ms. Lagarde, I can recall her statements a couple of months before that she is surprised by the enormous reforms which were implemented by Ukraine. So I think that Ukraine raised a lot of expectations about the reforms agenda and so on. Therefore, demand from IMF is higher than the supply side from Ukrainian. From Ukrainian government. Therefore, we hear these concerns, but generally, I might say that we are in the framework of our agreement or general arrangements with IMF, and what we see now is talks about details, particular topics that are not clarified, and also we have general problem connected with ability of government to implement program of cooperation with IMF and also implement those laws which were adopted last year in line with IMF recommendations.
And is this because the requirements from the IMF are to implement some harsh measures which are not popular would not be popular with the people, and the government is concerned about its political points, about its polls here in Ukraine, more than getting the economy back on track?
Let's put this question into another modalities. This is not about harsh measures. This is about more and more sophisticated measures to be applied by government. So we need to have more and more capable government, because we need to implement really sophisticated reforms in public finances, in pension reform, in social benefits. It doesn't mean that we need to cut pensions or to cut social benefits, but we need to verify this system.
So what is the problem with these reforms? The government is not, that you're saying that they're sophisticated. The government is not willing or is not able to do that?
Partially not willing, partially not able. Therefore, we have this loud talks about necessity to reshuffle government, to improve its quality, improve its ability to implement these sophisticated measures. And I think that all concerns we hear from IMF are connected with this capacity to implement reforms we are talking about when we are talking about cooperation with IMF. Of course, when we are talking about pension system, it means that there will be change of conditions for certain categories of people. It also sometimes difficult from political point of view, but it doesn't mean that generally IMF requires from us to just cut pensions. IMF just invite us and encourage us to reform finally pension system, to decrease deficit of pension fund, and so on. So it means that we need to go in depth with analyzing the problem we have with pension funds, the reason of this problem, and how to manage this problem, not only by adopting new law or new decree or new resolution, but also on the level of day-to-day operation of pension funds.
Mr. Kachka, let's play the devil's advocate here. What happens if the IMF withdraws its support to Ukraine? What happens to Ukraine's economy? On top of that, it would be a huge reputational blow for Ukraine.
Yes, for sure. So there is a most negative scenario and more or less moderate scenario if everything will go wrong. First of all, our cooperation with IMF is more or less connected with support on managing public debt of Ukrainians. So in this case, we need to...
So basically a lot of, some portions of the money from the IMF program are used to finance the existing sovereign debt of Ukraine.
So generally, yes. So I believe that generally Ukraine can cover its spendings, actual spendings, for example, on pensions, on educations, by revenues it collects from business. So after all, Ukrainian economy is still living, so business is paying taxes, and these taxes are directed to vulnerable people, to educational system, to local communities, and so on. Therefore, Ukraine is not, to 100% dependent from IMF money, but for sure, Ukraine will not be able to manage its public debt in line with arrangements agreed previous years with all creditors, private creditors and public creditors as well, without cooperation with
So basically,
IMF.
the worst case scenario is Ukraine's default on its foreign debt.
Or worst case scenario is that Ukraine should develop another plan of dealing with public debt. So that it doesn't mean default, it could be other solutions as well. But the problem is that we choose this option of, let's say, of rational negotiations with creditors 2 years ago, and we went through through a range of different negotiations, restructuring, different new deals with IMF, EU, United States, and so on. So therefore, for us, it is more reasonable to continue a cooperation with IMF than to say that goodbye IMF, we will choose another options. Other options are also available, but we will just lose time if we will just move our thoughts into another direction.
So what are these other options? So what alternatives does Ukraine have in case things go south with IMF?
I think all of them are more or less theoretical. Therefore, I don't think that we need to spend time on this, because it will be more generally speculations.
What about local currency? Ukraine's local currency has devaluated significantly in the past 2 years. How dependent is the local currency rate, exchange rate, on the support which Ukraine is getting from the IMF?
This is a really interesting question, because first of all, Ukrainian currency now is not protected by national bank as it was protected 3 or 4 years ago, when currency rate was #1 priority for national bank. Therefore, now currency rate is established by market. Therefore, market is driven by different moods, different news, and so on. And therefore, market is reacting on any news, negative or positive, about reforms, about cooperation with IMF, and so on. Therefore, these problem or concerns raised by IMF actually influence rates. But it is not the IMF as such or program of cooperation as such, but the position or attitude of government towards these topics. So I believe that any news on decrease of taxes or increase of taxes, or any decision on currency treatment or international movement of capital and other, let's say, economic reforms can influence positively or negatively currency rates, including the I think the one of most popular topic, the question of continuation of cooperation with IMF. So it is one of questions which can influence in different way currency rate.
Yeah, it looks like some very volatile situation here with both IMF program and the currency as well. Mr. Kachka, many thanks for joining us today. We were discussing the threatened IMF bailout program for Ukraine with the team leader at Ukraine Reforms Communications Taskforce, Mr. Taras Kachka. I'm Vladimir Rasulov. Thank you for watching Viewpoint.